So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Adil Amini. I'm a series producer in non-scripted entertainment. I'm the founder of the freelancer support group TV Mindset, which looks after freelancer mental health, along with a lot of other issues. I'm also the founder and chair of the pan-industry working group Coalition for Change, which has all the broadcasters, streamers, charities, and BAFTA, of course, as members. And as Siobhan said, I'm a member of the BAFTA TV committee. Now, I've been in the industry 15 years, and I've watched our industry face a lot of challenges, whether that's strikes, COVID, industry slowdowns, and the current crisis that we're going through at the moment. And while I'm not a climate expert myself, like many of you, I am beginning to recognise the potential impacts of climate change on our lives and our livelihoods. I mean, it's getting to that point where, we are all worried about our careers, but really, there's no way of having these jobs, no industry to work in, because the planet is in such a dire strait. Then that is obviously a worry for us all. As part of the Coalition for Change, we launched something called the Freelance Charter, which is a code of conduct for broadcasters and indies, and we're relaunching that in January. The updated version actually has an entirely new section on sustainability, and today we are going beyond thinking about just Albert and sustainability from a certification perspective. And we're going to concentrate on how it affects us and how we produce our content. So we're going to launch a poll now, just to gauge how much the climate is already impacting the work that you're doing. So hopefully Siobhan will be able to get that up for us now. Lovely. Okay, so please vote in that. Have you been a part of a production or work project that has negatively impacted negatively impacted by climate or extreme weather? So you've got your choices there. So I'll let you vote. For those of you who said it has had an impact, especially those that said a big impact, I'd love it if you could pop some examples into the chat, and we'll refer back to them later if you're happy and comfortable to do so. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists to support our understanding on the topic of climate resilience. And they're going to introduce themselves very briefly. So I'm just going to go around who I've got on my screen. So we'll start with Aoife.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So my name is Aoife Hutton. I'm a climate resilience manager at the sustainability charity Sniffer. I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. But I'm going to be presenting today around some of our kind of emerging work, working more closely with the screen sector, kind of where that overlap lies between climate risks and what can be done to build your resilience.
Thank you very much. Ryan.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ryan Morrison. I'm a Just Transition Officer at the Scottish Trade Union Congress, working around the various intersections between climate change impacts and climate change policy, and how that will affect and engage workers across the economy.
Thank you very much. Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy. I'm a freelance line producer working mainly in Scotland. Yeah, and I've done Albert, but so I'm not an expert in climate, but I just work in the industry.
Thank you, Wendy. And we are expecting Brodie very shortly, but in the meantime, we will crack on. So Aoife, to set the scene, you're going to talk to us a little bit more about the work Sniffer have been doing thus far. So I will hand over to you to tell us a bit more.
Brilliant, thanks Adil. And I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully it goes smoothly this time. Are you able to see my slides okay? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Right, I'll get started. So today I'm really just going to present a little bit of context for this work and some of the kind of emerging case studies coming from Scotland in terms of how climate impacts are affecting the sector. As I say, I work for an environmental charity. We're based in Edinburgh. We work across Scotland and more widely across the UK as well. Our vision is kind of a positive transformation for all, thinking about a fairer and flourishing future across our places in the context of a changing climate. So at the heart of what we do is very much around justice, looking at kind of co-benefits that we can build into this transition between a more climate resilient world. So context for why we're here today, these are just some of the headlines we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of climate impacts around the world. Now, this is in the context just now of seeing kind of on average about 1.25 degree warming to global average surface temperatures, and already the impacts of that are absolutely catastrophic. We know, looking at the projections ahead, this is only due to kind of increase and accelerate. So it's within this context that we kind of present the work today around adaptation. And when I talk about adaptation, that is one way of responding to climate change. So within the kind of climate change world, you could say, we often refer to different types of responses to climate change. So they can largely be categorized in 3 different circles here. So on the left-hand side, we have mitigation. Now that's all about presenting the causes of climate change, so reducing down those greenhouse gases that are being emitted. And for many years, our focus has really been there. So you hear terms around net zero, carbon neutral, emissions reduction. That all falls within the mitigation circle, and we absolutely need to be still continuing those efforts towards reducing greenhouse gases as much as possible. But we're now in a situation where we're seeing those impacts become more and more acute. And so alongside those efforts towards bringing down emissions, we also need what's called adaptation. So that's all about coping with those changes to our climate, both kind of gradual changes in our climate, as well as the more extreme kind of storm events like those that we saw in those headlines. So just to define adaptation, it's really quite a broad set of actions. So any action that we can take in order to reduce vulnerability to actual or expected impacts of climate change. So it could be things about looking at how are we building buildings, new builds, can we make them more resilient, for example, to those increased projections in rainfall? Can we look at where we're building new infrastructure? And just making sure that our systems are ready to cope with these new climates. It could be around contingency planning, so adaptation doesn't just need to be physical measures, but also thinking about systems, how we manage people, thinking about things like worker safety. And other actions can be nature-based, so trees are one of my favourite examples of adaptation action. They provide us with so many different benefits. So planting trees is going to help us to provide shade, reduce that overheating effect in the summer, but also help take up some additional surface water, so also acting as a flood resilience measure. So there's really a whole broad range of adaptation actions. Now we know that these adaptation actions over time can lead ultimately to increased resilience. What we've seen in Scotland so far, and this kind of applies wider across the UK as well, but I do work specifically in Scotland, so I'm going to kind of talk in that context today, but hopefully you can see the relevance to wherever you're calling in from. I know we've got lots of international callers on the webinar today as well. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is record-breaking extremes of all weather types, not just flooding. I think particularly in the UK, we often think mainly about those kind of rainfall patterns, but we've also seen record-breaking temperatures. The 10 most warm years have all occurred in Scotland since 1997, with the hottest year on record being last year. We're seeing wetter winters, drier summers, but also unpredictable downpour events. So really what we're losing is that kind of predictable seasonality, and that affects all sorts of different sectors, from agriculture right through to yourselves within the screen sector. So how might the screen sector be impacted by these different climate variables? So again, it can kind of affect all parts along that kind of trajectory of production, from production, post-production, screening can all be disrupted, and each of these kind of parts of the industry will have specific vulnerabilities. Work on site, for example, might be more prone to hazards related to infrastructure disruption, whereas other parts of the sector might be more affected by premises related damage, for example. So on the screen there, we've got some of the different factors that we're seeing starting to emerge. So thinking about folks working outside, heat stroke, fatigue, dehydration. Last year in Scotland, we saw 34.7 degree kind of peak temperature. So people working kind of outside in those conditions and the particular hazards they might be exposed to. We're also seeing implications on policies and insurance. People starting to find it harder to get insurance that's going to cover all those different eventualities. So what I'm really here to talk about today is a piece of work that Sniffer carried out a few years ago with a number of trade unions in Scotland, so STUC. We've got Ryan Morrison on the call today, as well as Unison Scotland. And what they wanted to do was look at these emerging climate hazards from the perspective of the impacts on workers, because what we know is that climate change tends to worsen those existing inequalities that we already have in society. So particularly prone to these climate hazards are going to be, for example, people on 0 hours contracts, people that might rely on public transport to get about, and those kind of already disadvantaged in different ways. So we were quite interested to look at what is the intersection between those climate hazards and kind of workers' rights agenda. Now, while this piece of work was produced from a trade union perspective, it's not limited in its application to trade unions. Anyone can kind of pick up these resources and use them in their different contexts. So some of the research that came out from kind of the initial scoping for creation of a resource that brought together a kind of trade union perspective and climate impacts was that there's a real issue here in terms of people feel like their workplaces are not adequately prepared to deal with the changing climate. So only 16.7% of respondents felt that the workplace was resilient to weather-related risks. 72% of respondents said that they, in their own kind of perception, had noticed that climate impacts were happening more frequently and or was having more severe effects on their workplace and workers. And you can see there some of the quotes kind of emerging from that research. So people talking about difficulties in getting to the workplace as a result of damage to public infrastructure, whether it's roads, trains, buses, and so on. We've then also had examples of kind of very high impact storms over the last few years. So thinking back to Beast from the East, or even the summer heatwave event of 2018, where we saw the closure of many workplaces as a result of kind of not being adapted to cooling. We've built a lot of new builds in Scotland that have really been built with energy efficiency in mind, really well insulated, which is brilliant to see. But on the other hand, we maybe haven't thought about cooling or ventilation because we haven't been in that context before. So that's kind of the difficulty with adaptation, is we're not just thinking about the current conditions, but we're adapting to future climates that we haven't necessarily experienced in this country before. So what did we actually deliver through the project? So a number of resources were created. So on the left-hand side, we've got the Climate Hazards and Resilience in the Workplace Handbook. Now that really sets out the case for action. It's not sector specific. Again, it's kind of designed broadly to be applicable across a range of different workplaces. It does divide it up into different settings. So there's guidance for indoor workers, guidance for outdoor workers, guidance for offshore workers, and kind of the particular vulnerabilities they might be exposed to. And then the second piece, and for me, this is really the crux of it, is the actual tools for practical action. Now, within the workbook are a number of checklists, and anyone involved in a union will know that trade unionists love a checklist. So this is, again, it's not specific to those already working in sustainability. These checklists are really being designed to be picked up by anyone within the sector, and to start to think about what are these different points that might be relevant to your workplace. Now, not only are the checklists designed to actually assess different risks, but also to then identify what actions can be put in place to mitigate those risks. So very much an action-focused piece of work. So I'm going to very briefly speak through a case study of how we've used these checklists within the screen sector. So Glasgow City Council have been working with ourselves at Sniffer over the past year or so through a number of different projects designed to kind of pilot different approaches to adaptation and resilience in different sectors across the city. Now, Glasgow City Council recognised that film and screen have a growing economic importance to the city. It's it's one of the real growth areas, and Glasgow is very much seen as a hub within Scotland for that industry. So we were linked up with the wonderful folks over at City Glasgow, which is, if anyone knows the building, it's kind of the old Govan town hall, built in 1901, category B listed building. So it's quite an interesting situation where we've got a really gorgeous kind of old building, and then within it, kitted out kind of to the highest specification. You've got Scotland's first Dolby Premiere studio within there, really high-tech sound equipment. There's a Foley studio. There's 25 different permanent tenants use that building. And again, they range kind of all stages through production, animation, casting, design, music, and so on, all using that space together. So we thought this was quite an interesting case study to kind of apply some of these new climate hazards in the workplace tools and see what comes through. As far as we're aware, this is kind of the first example of that resource being used specifically within the screen sector. So as I say, it's fairly new stuff. It's very much an opening to a wider conversation, and I hope that today can kind of kick us off in some of those bigger questions as well. So what did we look at? So we were really interested in looking at, okay, who is using this building? Who might be most vulnerable to those different climate risks? Who might need support to increase their resilience? Where on site is most likely to be at risk? So thinking about, are there areas that might be prone to flooding? What does the basement look like? Where is equipment stored in terms of vital equipment, wiring and assets? And what is business and safety critical for the site and must be protected at all costs? So we ran through a number of checklists from the tools, in particular checklist 9, which is questions for a site walk around. And again, don't have to be a climate expert to use this. It very much lays it out question by question. And this particular checklist goes through a number of different hazards. Now, we were particularly interested in the rainfall and flooding aspect due to the location of that site on Govan Road. And we went round with members of the team at City Glasgow. That was a really important learning point, as well as it's so good to have people who are very familiar with the asset that you might be doing a risk assessment of, who kind of have that lived experience of where there might be particular vulnerabilities in the building. So we went through these different checklists with the team, and then looked at the adaptation actions that could be taken in response to some of the vulnerabilities that we identified. The key findings at City Glasgow was there are a number of priority risks where there's kind of potential to build better resilience. So the site was perhaps prone to surface water flooding. There was an issue potentially around lone worker procedures, and again, just some of these have kind of wider application beyond climate change. It can be kind of those wider questions around how does a workplace operate. Due to the kind of the age of that building as well, there was a particular risk around storm or freeze thaw weathering. And lastly, thermal comfort. And the thermal comfort aspect, you can kind of imagine trying to heat a kind of Victorian era building, and that kind of particular challenges there. And again, as we can see more storm events, that thermal comfort will be very important to keep an eye on. How do we keep workers both warm as well as well ventilated and cool when we need to? So there were a number of potential opportunities for action going forward. So looking at how heating is done within the building, is there opportunity for zonation, for example? We also spoke about the kind of emerging opportunities around virtual reality. Is this kind of a diversification within the industry that can allow business continuity when there might be more disruption in the future? And we also spoke largely around adaptation actions that don't just address climate hazards, but also think about that kind of worker welfare in the whole. So thinking about, is there a need for PPE, for example, that generally helps contribute to better site safety. So just to round us up, some take-home messages. What's really important to do is to kind of start thinking about these risks and plan different risk mitigations, ideally before the incidents happen. And that's generally how we frame adaptation. Is it's much cheaper in the long run to think about prevention rather than trying to recover from an incident. Sometimes that's not always possible, but the quicker we can start to think about these different eventualities, the more effective we can be in our kind of action to prevent. Also important to think about supply chain. Now, this came up really in reference to some on-site productions where there was quite complicated supply chains in place for set design. So again, just thinking about any kind of time frames for delivery, could they be affected? Is there potentially contingency time that could be built in? What we've seen more generally over the last few years is that the systems underpinning modern life are more vulnerable than we like to think. And I think that really, I noticed that a lot during Beasts from the East back in 2018, when within a few days there was no food in the supermarkets, and realizing how vulnerable some of our systems are and that kind of need for wider resilience, not just in this industry, but many. We need to take a cautionary approach in terms of our action. What we do know is there's a bit of a lag time really between the trends and projections that we see versus the on the ground impacts that are playing out. In fact, we've seen recorded much worse climate impacts than we kind of already projected for this time frame. So we do need to be very much taking a precautionary principle in how we plan things. And lastly, just the impacts could be surprising. So this is a piece of art at the bottom by Tim Etchells, which I love. The future will be confusing, and I think that kind of sums it up. When we talk about adaptation, it's not about getting to one particular end state. Adaptation is very much a process, and it will require an active approach to keep checking back new and emerging risks as they happen. Because with climate projections, we're seeing changes all the time in terms of the types of conditions we might come to expect. So we do need to take into account that wide range of uncertainties, things that we can't predict, and build in different types of contingency plans. If you would like to have a look at any of the resources I've mentioned today, I will put the links in the chat, sniffer.org.uk. We also have the programme Adaptation Scotland, which is a government-funded programme looking at climate risk and resilience in Scotland, and there's loads of different resources on there. And again, not just applicable to Scotland, but hopefully with kind of a wider application as well. And I'd just like to acknowledge Film City Glasgow as well for their help in letting us pilot these tools on their site. They were really great to work with, as well as Glasgow City Council and colleagues at STUC and Unison Scotland. And I'll finish up there and kind of hand back for some discussion.
Thank you very much, Aoife. That's very detailed, and obviously we're very grateful for the work that you're all doing, because I think certainly in my career it's become a thing where climate change and this sort of issue has always felt more like an abstract concept, something that wouldn't affect us. And as you've rightly pointed out, and I've worked at Film City as well, this is now very much at our doorstep, and it's not just something that might affect some foreign shoot or whatever. It's very much here and now, and as you pointed out on your slide, it's affecting the frontline workers. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Ryan. So Ryan, can you tell us about how the STUC have been working with Sniffer and the areas of crossover, and what do we mean when we're talking about climate resilience in relation to the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aoife has provided quite a comprehensive look at that specific piece of work where the STUC had been involved with Sniffer and Unison as well, one of the largest unions in the UK, to talk about how workers were already being impacted and what they could be anticipating for. And really our role in that and our focus has been on making sure that it's really workers' voices and experiences that are quite central to the development of plans and policies to how we deal with that. And so we're always interested in making sure that where there are live examples that people have either experienced some challenges around this, or where they are already making plans themselves for their workplace or for their sector, then we're doing everything we can to kind of hold those up, partly to make sure that we can embed good practice and use those as kind of signaling for other places to pick up from, but also so we can catch where there's bad practice happening, to make sure that the protections that we have there are better suited to as you say, the changing weather patterns that are going to become increasingly volatile, really, and what we might see as more extreme weather in different parts of the seasons, but also across the country. And I mean, when we talk about climate resilience, I mean, for the STUC here, we're sort of the affiliate organisation for the trade union movement in Scotland. So most of the trade unions in Scotland will be affiliate members, and they've identified through the STUC that they want just transition and climate change to be a real priority focus. And the reason for that is, you know, we talk about it as future-proofing work, and that's both in terms of what Aoife mentioned in terms of mitigation. What does it mean to reduce emissions for different sectors? And that's most obviously seen when we look at energy and transport and around home heating, for instance. But actually that also includes what does it mean to adapt to climate change, and how safe are workers, and health and safety are really fundamental trade union issues. So we talk in language of future-proofing, making sure that it's not people in the front line of these sectors that are ultimately expected to deal with the uncertainty themselves or to pay the cost. And we talk about just transition for that reason. It's about who benefits, who's involved in decision making, and ultimately who will pay and see change happening to them or around them.
It does lead me on very nicely to my next question. I mean, I think it's really interesting as well that we are now in the phase where we're using the term climate resilience. You know, this is already happening, and we're having to, you know, defend ourselves against it rather than, you know, it's already here. Which does lead me, you know, to what you were saying basically about, well, decision makers as well. But firstly, there's so many freelance workers. Why is it so important to them to consider how their work is being impacted? But also, what should big organisations like broadcasters and studios be doing to protect them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only be quite blunt on the first part of that, which is just that employment rights in the UK are relatively weak, particularly compared to counterparts in Europe. So, you know, we can see examples that are very relevant to these weather issues. Employers have a duty of care to their employees, but there is no minimum or maximum temperature guidance. So that duty of care can be open to interpretation regardless of the temperature it reaches. You're not given any specific temperature at which you can say we're not working in this, even though it's completely unsuitable. We've heard experiences of people who work outdoors and being made to work in -20 degrees Celsius, being offered a set of overalls in addition to their usual uniform. And that the important thing there is that those are the protections, or the lack of protections, that exist for employees. So the situation for freelancers is obviously even more precarious often. And I think I'm not myself overly familiar with the production sector, but we do have a lot of conversations with people who are freelance elsewhere. And what we know is that for people who rely on contracts in the year, the prospect of weather disruption can be the difference between a livable income or little to no work. And what we're most interested in is that it is people who are on the front line of these sectors that have the best understanding of the way in which climate change and changing weather patterns will affect them. So it's those people who understand exactly how tight the timeframes are for the logistics and the supply of materials that might be used throughout, but it's also you're the people who ultimately will be traveling or relying on getting to destinations, or other people getting to destinations in order to do this kind of work. And so for us, one of the reasons that we think it's important for freelance workers, for all workers, to be thinking about this is to make sure you are ahead of the game. And as Aoife was talking about, this is about being ready early so that you can then have conversations about, okay, well, what does that mean for the project you're working on? What does it mean for the contract you're taking? How do you make sure that you protect and kind of insulate yourself from the type of disruption that you might see, so that the burden of that isn't placed on you, affecting your income and affecting the work that you're able to do throughout the year?
I think that's a very valid point. I think if I may jump in just with my area of expertise, I think, you know, what we do on the front line is already our mental health is so impacted by already like long working hours, bullying and harassment culture. And then you add this extra layer, which is, you know, safety and protection. And you know, we'll talk to Wendy about this very shortly, but ultimately it comes down to us, which I don't think is particularly fair. I think certainly the mental health impact, you know, we're looking at these stories every day in the news, and you know, you're sort of almost walking into work with that sort of negative cloud over your head. You're like, oh my God, you know, the planet is doomed. And then having to fight for your own survival in there. You know, we are employed by other people, and ultimately that's where the buck should stop. And you know, even before we were sort of talking earlier with Siobhan actually about there is that worry of everything that we do is great, but there is also a risk of like paper straw syndrome as well, where there's these tiny changes that we're making, but what are the people above us doing? Is my company CEO still using a private jet? All of those things is like we've got to have like this ecosystem, but certainly in terms of the welfare and protection mentally as well, I think there's a huge impact, and obviously that's why we're having this discussion. I do want to move on, but very quickly, Ryan, I do want to ask, because I think it's very interesting, even for me, is that we are with the coalition. We're trying to keep a clear channel where if you feel like your welfare is under threat, that you can report directly. But is there anything that if you feel like perhaps there is an unsafe environment with the climate? I know there's no legal protection, but is there anywhere you could recommend to go, or would you recommend people going to their broadcasters and flagging this?
That won't be overly surprising. I'd encourage you to, if you are not already a member of a trade union, to join a trade union and to seek the kind of security that can only come from being collector. I have worked before with BECTU Vision, obviously operating within the sector. That in there. What I would also say is we kind of appreciate that that's not always possible for some people. There might not be a recognised trade union on site, or for a sector like yourself where it's often freelance workers, you're kind of looking more at sectoral bargaining is really the kind of optimum way to manage that. But in the meantime, in the absence of that, we have launched a survey that will sit long-standing across our project, which is looking to get more experiences of people as they're dealing with severe weather impacts. And we want to then, as I mentioned at the beginning, use those to highlight good examples, offer our support and the resources like the hazards toolkit that we've been going through today, but also to be able to use that to put pressure on publicly, to be talking to the press, to be using that to talk to the government, to be able to say, look, in the absence of better protections and in the absence of any collective bargaining structures here, what we're seeing is workers being asked to bear the brunt and dealing with the impacts of climate change as they unfold. So, I mean, I can obviously share a link with people here, but in the first instance, if you do feel that you're not particularly comfortable speaking to the company that you are or the client that you're working with at the time, then I would definitely say to get in touch with any relevant trade union. And there's a lot of tools that help you find which trade union might be most beneficial to you. And I know a lot of people might, some people sit in trade union for a long time, or some people have never joined a trade union, but I would strongly encourage it, and to have those conversations with other people in the sector through those structures where you are able to kind of collectively self-organise.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very helpful. So we want to highlight some real world examples, and we're not looking in the future as we've been discussing. These things are happening now. There was some after the poll earlier. We had a few people post in the chat. So there's somebody from Canada here said that wildfire smoke affected filming over the summer months, and we've all seen the news reports. We know that there's you never know when something like that's going to end. So that the impact on schedules, budgets, all of that, well, even staff as well. You think you've got a job lined up, it's gone because of something that's out of anyone's control at this point. Big impacts in Iceland when producing TV shows, shooting in rural areas and burning diesel fuel. A crew of 600 people and 100 extras outdoors in -15 Celsius. The battery generators did not work in low temperature. Again, very real world, very practical examples. And on that note, actually, Wendy, so you've had some very practical experience on this front. Can you talk us through the issues that you faced both last year in the sort of in the 40-degree heat, I believe it was, and more recently with Storm Babette?
Well, just recently we were filming a kind of independent film in Scotland, quite a lot of exterior locations, and as Storm Babette was coming, we had a location coming up which we had already it was sort of on some high ground, and because of the nature of what we were doing, we had already risk assessed it with mountain safety experts, and so we had always discussed that if it was particularly wet, it might not be possible to film there. And then as Storm Babette was coming, we realised that it was probably going to be really unlikely we could film there. It was early in our shoot, and we didn't therefore have anything really that we could go into for weather cover. We managed the day before to pull something together to give us part of a day to shoot. But basically on the morning, we went and looked at that location with mountain safety, but also another location we had, which also felt dangerous because of the storm, because there was trees that looked like they could come down. So we just had to basically, we managed to shoot a little bit in the weather cover that we pulled together, but we had to stand down for 2 days, which was totally a health and safety issue. And I think, I suppose we've been quite lucky. I think we're hopefully going to get insurance. We're not, you can't insure against adverse weather per se, but because it was the storm and because we'd alerted them and we'd mitigated as much as possible, I think we're going to be okay. But I think that it's that idea that you have to be able to kind of dynamically risk assess on the day when something like that happens, and you kind of can't wait. You have to kind of think ahead, but you only have so much time to think ahead with something like that, because you only find out a couple of days before. So yeah, I mean, basically we had to stand down for 2 days and we had to reschedule around it going forward. And similarly, this didn't stop us filming, but we also had a unit base which later in the shoot just became completely flooded, to the point that we were having to build bridges between the facilities vehicles, and we had to hire like a gully sucker tank to come and drain water from the unit base, just because the rain was so heavy. So I think that, I think in Scotland we're quite used to dealing with adverse weather, because of the nature of Scotland and how beautiful it is. People tend to film outdoors here, maybe more than in London or wherever. But I think that even with that, you can't plan for some of those things. You just and also especially with independent film, where it's a short-term setup, you can't have things in place for every possibility. Really, you have to deal with it as it happens a bit more. So I think that's why I think in sort of a studio setting or a building setting, you can put things in place, you can future-proof a bit, but it's quite hard to do that for a short-term project, I suppose. The opposite to that was like a year or so ago, I was on a job at another independent film where we actually were filming. We actually went to London during the heat wave struck. So most of our Scottish crew were traveling on trains the 40 degrees day, which was mad because the trains were all stopped and overcrowded and what have you. But once we got there, we were just desperately trying to get hold of air conditioning units for some of because one of our locations had like whole glass walls, so it was absolutely boiling. And it was just you couldn't like, even if you had all the money in the world, you couldn't get one because they'd all just been hired. So again, it's just that thing of like, you can't really have those things on standby, but then suddenly we're not really set up for those extreme weather, and you can plan as much as possible, but it is quite hard when something that extreme happens. So yeah, I don't really have a solution as such, but but I think you just have to keep
No, I mean
you have to
we
assess daily, really.
And we, when we sort of set this up as well, we knew that this was always going to be the start of a conversation, and that we're not going to solve everything in this hour. So obviously not looking for any major solutions today, but I think those examples are really, really helpful. I wanted to ask actually, Wendy, just sort of a little, just more on the personal side of things, about the sort of impact of making those calls. So 2 questions really. How much of this does come down to somebody like, the line producer and production management side of things? And also, do you feel like there's adequate training in the industry to deal with this sort of stuff? Or we, like everything else, are we just sort of learning on the job and dealing with these massive issues? So it'd be good to get your insight on both of those things.
I mean, I think, I suppose it's like, I suppose the thing with our industry is that you are always kind of troubleshooting to a certain degree, and you have to roll with the punches. And I suppose, you know, when we had to stand stuff down, obviously there were certain people that we couldn't stand down because, like, you know, my department were having to rebook everyone's travel and contact the cast that we were moving about and stuff. Like the art department were pulling other stuff together as the schedule was changing. So it does impact you know, all manner of departments, really, just because it causes you to have to rethink things. Do you know what I mean? So I think it does.
Yeah.
But I suppose that's, you know, that's not dissimilar to when, you know, if a cast member caught COVID, or, you know, it's just another issue that you have to work around and deal with. I think I mean, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think that I think our industry are becoming much more aware of sustainability, and we do Albert and everything. But I suppose in terms of training in how to deal with the impact is maybe we don't have it as such. But then I don't know. But we don't know what the impacts are until they happen either. I suppose, do you know what I mean? Because I think it's kind of about, I mean, I think the biggest thing is it's health and safety more than anything, isn't it? It's about becomes a health and safety issue. So it's just about, and we were kind of quite lucky because of the nature of the location we were filming on this year. We already had those experts, mountain safety experts, with us to help us risk assess that on the day. So I suppose it's maybe about having more stringent health and safety, like, because we don't tend to, on smaller things, have a health and safety consultant with us all the time. But maybe that's something, you know, that might need to become more of a thing. But I mean, it'd be great to have more training, but it is hard as well to know what exactly that's in, other than do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, I do. That's why I asked the question as well. It's you know, but we've sort of gotten, you know, I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but, you know, getting into these roles and sort of moving, I'm learning on the job. But as a series producer, I could say, look, I don't know. I'd be relying on someone else to tell me when it becomes an unsafe condition, because I haven't had that training. What do I need to look around and see? And it's interesting you mentioned COVID, because obviously that was a new situation, and a lot of productions ended up finding time and space and money for COVID supervisors. And now you sort of look at these conversations and you wonder whether there is a space and a need for something like that on productions. That would also, and going back to what you said earlier, and again, the reason I asked that question is that I've seen what production management do, and I often feel it's very unsung and thankless at times. But all of those things that you're mentioning, that's coming onto the production side of things, coming onto your team. That means longer hours for you, more tiredness, all of that stuff, all the stuff that we talk about in welfare. This has a knock-on effect. So it is very, very important for the sustainability of the industry as well, and sort of the mental health ecosystem. Opening it up actually wider, very good point on health and safety. Do you think the decision we're making, do the existing health and safety frameworks, are they adequate, or do we need to, you know, be more specific about climate and weather within them? This is open to all of you.
I'm sure Ryan has thoughts on this too, but I'll maybe sneak in. Yeah, I mean, what we know is that health and safety regulation doesn't equal safety, unfortunately, especially when it comes to climate risk. There's a real lag between the kind of new impacts that we're seeing now. By the time they get to a point of policy, it can be an 8 to 12 year lag by the time we're actually thinking about new risks. So there's a real big gap here between what health and safety is delivering versus these new emerging risks. So it is needing to go above and beyond, and I appreciate that that's really, really difficult if it's not within legislation to then kind of make the case, especially when resources are already tight. I think there is some learning from what other sectors are doing just now. So construction in particular have been hugely affected by climate impacts in a very financial way, in that small delays to projects when you're renting, huge plant equipment has very big costs. So what they've actually started to do within construction contracts is put in different kind of time delay clauses, making sure that kind of small contractors aren't financially liable for delays where there's a health and safety element and things have had to be delayed. So I think that is something that kind of we would like to see more leadership from those kind of broadcasters and commissioners in terms of expectations for time, and that would have knock-on positive impacts in terms of health and safety. I think a real asset of this sector is your adaptability and kind of how agile you've had to be under different stresses, and also that kind of ability to have creative solutions too. And there's something there about collecting these stories and examples. And Wendy, it was great to hear from you about kind of that having to make decisions in quite stressful conditions, and actually collecting those stories could be really helpful to kind of share across the wider sector as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the adaptability thing is really interesting. I mean, my personal view is that I think sometimes that gets taken for granted. The fact that we will just, because we're, if you speak up about certain things and, you as a freelancer, there's historically a fear of speaking out and speaking up against this. And a lot of people will just put stuff on you and say, yeah, you'll roll with it, you'll deal with it, because, and I think that needs to change as well. So again, I think there's a whole cultural impact on this. I think in a more practical sense, I think insurance is a really interesting one. Obviously, we all deal with it in the productions that we work with, whether it's studio or location, high end, anything like that. Do you think there will continue to be insurance to protect us? And are there any key clauses that we need to be on the lookout for? Is that good to all of you?
I think you can't. I mean, at the moment, my understanding is you can't really insure against weather disruption as such, which is why historically, in Scotland, we've always filmed through the rain and and the snow, what have you. I think if something I think that if it's impossible to film or dangerous to film, you can be covered by insurance as long as you have enough kind of backup and show that you've done everything possible to mitigate that. But I think it is, I mean, insurance by its nature is quite risk averse anyway, isn't it? So I think you just have to be very, I think you just have to be very aware and always talking to your insurers and be very aware of things as they're happening and keeping them abreast and then, keeping as much evidence as you possibly can. I mean, we had to have, as I say, we were lucky that we had the mountain safety people with us who wrote us a report, but we had to send reports by various HODs. We had to send videos. We did have a lot of backup material to go to our insurers. But I think, I think their first thing is always try to, they always want you to try to carry on filming in some way if you can. But I think if it's a health and safety thing, most, you can't. So you have to stop and find an alternative, really. So yeah, definitely.
I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to refer to a couple of questions. If you do have anything you'd like to ask, please put that in the Q&A box and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But to all of you, obviously we'd love the audience to go away with some practical ideas of things that they can do. So if you could offer your primary recommendation as to how this audience can build climate resilience in their work life, what would it be? I'll start with Aoife and go around.
Yeah, so I'm just going to plug that resource again. So the Climate Hazards in the Workplace checklist, even just a brief look through that on a personal level is worth doing. There might be some actions within there that are quite implementable. Some of them are bigger scale actions, but there are some quite practical steps to start to think about. So yeah, I would recommend everyone to have a look at that. There's also a kind of a webinar in more detail on that that's recorded on the website. So I'll pop that link in the chat again.
Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think to maybe say something different, because I would also have recommended the toolkit. I guess if you're looking to see how this will affect you, either as if you're someone that is an employee as opposed to someone who's a freelancer, or vice versa, is if you're an employee, I would ask within your company whether or not there is a severe weather policy and what that is. And if there's not, then begin that conversation. And that's really to sort of set the framework for at what stage of extreme weather, what do you mean by that? And what is the consequences for people in the business and in terms of travel and things like that? And if you're a freelancer, maybe looking the other way at maybe any of your last contracts or employment deals with other people, have a look through and kind of ask yourself, based on that contract, what would have happened if production had been stopped for 2 or 3 days, as an example, and how would you have been treated? What would have happened to you? What would have happened to the rest of your contract? What would have happened to the payment for your services? And then what would it take in that contract for you to be more secure, to you to have more, or what would it mean in the project for there to be more resilience so that the weather disruption wouldn't necessarily have completely disrupted things, and also build that conversation into the conversations you have with employers or potential clients. I'd always recommend doing that collectively because there is greater power in the many number of you. But I do think having an understanding of how this will affect you based on existing contracts that you're working to will help you get ahead of this before you're in the situation, for instance, that Wendy potentially found herself in of this is happening now and we need to react. Try and build from the examples that you hear from, including Wendy's.
Thank you. Wendy, do you have any recommendations or a primary recommendation you pass on?
I mean, I suppose it's just not so much on a personal level, I suppose, but I suppose it's just that as much as possible we need to be able, which I think we've is difficult on lower budgets, but I think we need to be able to have elements of weather cover in our schedules more than we've ever needed to before. So, you kind of want to ideally, have some indoor safe locations built in that you can go to, in a hurry if you have to. I think what was difficult for us was that it was at the start of our shoot and they were never going to be ready. And I think that that's quite often the case, but I think we maybe do need to really seriously think about that on productions going forward if there's quite a lot of exterior filming, because I'd hate to think that we have to make everything in studios going forward, but I think we need to have elements of that we can go to if and when there's a storm or what have you.
There is you've helped answer one of the Q&A questions actually from Katie in who's here watching today, which was, do you foresee more studio work in future over location filming in order to adapt? Again, open to all of you, and Wendy, you've just touched on it there, but do we think that's the future?
I mean, I hope not, because I really prefer location shooting, and I think there's lots of amazing locations in Scotland, and I think that studios aren't necessarily affordable for a lot of projects, and also they're so busy, but maybe it is the future, I'm not sure.
We've got one more question before we wrap up. Does the panel think that the terrible working hours in the industry partly contribute to unsustainability in the UK TV and film industry? Ryan's got a wry smile there.
I mean, I'm no expert in the sector, but I think we are very familiar with the type of employment practice that can go on in places where there's a lot of freelancing or precarious employment, I think. And I think really the issues are, from film production, but into financial services and even into hospitality in particular, where some of these issues come up again and again. And I think to draw it to where we are here, yes, it is unsustainable, and yes, it is better to have more collective bargaining coverage in order to deal with that. But one of the issues that also comes up with when you're talking about something like severe weather is where I said before that employers have a duty of care. If it's your responsibility to get to work, which under UK employment law it is, then it's possible for an employer when you're on a precarious contract to say, well, if you can't get to work, even if it's extreme weather, we're not paying you. And that, for people who are on precarious contracts, is an impossible decision between getting to work in unsafe conditions and not getting paid. And we saw that with Storm Babbitt. I think we saw Angus Council and this is the limitations of employment rights in this country. Angus Council had posted saying on their Facebook group to the local community saying, you know, there is no appointments for the local council. Don't come to your appointments. And they also said, if you are an employer, please consider letting your employees work from home. And that was in a red weather alert from the Met Office, right? That is the most severe risk to life warning system that the Met Office can provide for that situation. And the request was, please don't make your employees come to work. I think we can be demanding a lot better than that. And one of the issues is precarious contracts often.
Thank you. I think just one take home from me as well, and then primary recommendation is that, you know, initially when BAFTA Albert asked me to chair this, I said, look, I'm not a climate expert, or why would I do it? But through this conversation, and the more I've sort of got delved into this world, it very much links to the work that we're doing with the coalition, the work that BECTU is doing, the work that unions are doing as well. Because what I've realised is that much like every other issue in this industry that we cover in the charter, whether it's training, working hours, is that this needs all of us to work together, whether it's on the production, but certainly from the top down, it needs proper strategy and insight. And that includes longer lead times, you know, better budget, more contingency, and, you know, better provisions for the staff who will be, and then the freelancers who will be on the front line for this. So, you know, certainly from my point of view, and it's really informed my campaigning as well, because it just feels like in order to have a more sustainable industry, you know, in terms of the environment, we also need to be more sustainable and work together across all departments in every other aspect as well. So I think on that level as well, it's been really helpful. And I think the burden isn't just on us as it always, or, you know, historically has been. It is all about, as we said earlier, the power brokers, the decision makers as well, who need to come to the table, because this will, you know, it will affect their profits, it will affect livelihoods, it will affect everything. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Aoife, Ryan, Wendy, thank you so much.